Okay, so we're deep diving into better small talk.
Yeah.
I get it. Like on the surface, it's kind of like, oh, tell me about the weather again. But what if I told you this book digs into some pretty surprising benefits? Like beyond just surviving those awkward silences at parties, we're talking potentially happier, more fulfilling relationships just from upping your small talk game. Intrigued.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating how much research actually backs that up. The link between deeper conversations and our overall well-being, it's not just about being chatty. It's like tapping into something fundamental about our social nature, you know?
Totally. So the author kicks things off with this idea that we're hardwired for connection, which makes sense, right? We're social creatures at our core,
Right.
UT. And this is the kicker. He says somewhere along the way, we've developed this almost irrational fear of those small everyday interactions.
Yeah. It's like we've forgotten how to function in those spaces between the big moments in life. Like we're constantly plugged in, headphones on faces in our phones, all to avoid those seemingly insignificant interactions. But those tiny moments, those 10-second relationships, as he calls them, they can actually have a surprisingly huge impact on our mood and our overall outlook, for better or worse.
That's so true. And it's not just about chatting up strangers at a bus stop either. He even suggests, get this, practicing small talk with your barista or your cashier. I mean, they're kind of a captive audience, right? And honestly, they probably appreciate a little friendly chat to break up the monotony of their day.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a good way to take the pressure off yourself, too, because it's low stakes. You can try out different things, experiment a bit,
Yeah.
and see what works without worrying about it going completely off the rails. It's like a conversational gym in a way.
I love that analogy. So speaking of warming up those conversation muscles, the book actually gives a bunch of surprisingly fun exercises to try,
Yeah.
like before you even head out the door.
Right. And some of them are hilarious, like reading aloud with exaggerated emotion, like you're telling a story to a room full of second graders. I'll admit I was skeptical at first, but it really does loosen you up, and it helps you get comfortable with like actually using your voice.
Yeah. It's about getting out of your head and into your body,
Mm.
kind of like shaking off those pre-performance jitters. But honestly, my favorite pre-game ritual, he suggests, is creating what he calls a conversation resume.
Oh, interesting. Tell me more about this conversation resume.
Okay, so it's actually genius. It's like instead of drawing a blank when someone asks what's new,
Mhm.
you've got this mental cheat sheet of interesting things about yourself ready to go.
Right.
Like you prep a few stories from your week, maybe something interesting you learned recently, anything that could spark a conversation. It's about being more mindful of the value you bring to the table, conversationally speaking.
I love that. Yeah. Because too often we default to those generic, oh, not much responses. It's like we're trying to be invisible. But everyone has a story, something unique to offer. And that conversation resume idea, I don't know, it helps you tap into that and
Yeah.
present your most interesting self.
Exactly. So, okay, now that we're warmed up and we've got our conversation resumes prepped and ready, how do we actually break the ice
Yeah.
without resorting to those cheesy pickup lines?
Well, forget the cheesy pickup lines. This author is all about ditching those and instead finding those little commonalities that can spark a genuine connection.
He talks a lot about how conversation has stages, right? Like you start with the light stuff,
Mm.
the small talk, and then gradually go deeper as you build rapport.
Yeah, and what's interesting is he says by finding even those small points of similarity early on, like a shared taste in music
Yeah.
or a common experience, even just being at the same event, you
Yeah.
can actually speed up that process of
Yep.
building rapport and moving beyond the superficial.
Okay, so how do we do that? Like, what are some practical ways to find those common threads
Yeah.
without seeming,
Yeah.
creepy or overly eager?
One tactic that I thought was really clever is he suggests asking for objective information or opinions. It's brilliant because it feels natural and it doesn't put any pressure on the other person.
Okay, I need an example.
Okay, so let's say you're at a party and you want to start a conversation with someone. Instead of hitting them with, so what do you do?
Mm-hmm.
You could casually comment on the architecture of the building or like ask their opinion on a piece of art that's there. You're inviting them to engage with you, but it feels low pressure. And if they don't bite, no harm, no foul.
Yeah. It's about finding those little doorways that invite further conversation without forcing it.
Yeah.
So instead of like breaking the ice, it's more like you're gently melting it a little at a time.
Exactly. And then once you've got that initial interaction going, the author is really big on using storytelling as a way to make your conversations more engaging. And I don't mean launching into this big, long story. It's about finding those little bite-sized stories and kind of weaving them into your responses, even to simple questions, like adding that human touch, you know?
Right. So instead of just saying, oh, work was crazy,
Yeah.
you could say, well, did I tell you about the dog in the tuxedo that wandered into my office on Friday? He proceeded to pee on absolutely everything.
Exactly. See, that's a story.
It's so much better.
And it's not about making stuff up. It's about finding those interesting threads in your own life
Yeah.
and like sharing them in a way that draws people in.
Totally.
Yeah.
And he also talks about the importance of evoking emotion with your stories. And again, it doesn't have to be some big epic drama.
Yeah.
Like even a simple story about a frustrating commute
Yeah.
can be really captivating if you share how it made you feel, like maybe a little exasperated
Yeah.
or secretly amused by the absurdity of it all.
It's that human connection, right? That shared experience of emotion makes it so much more memorable, so much more relatable. He even breaks down this helpful framework he calls the story spine, which kind of outlines the key elements of a good story. And get this, he uses the theme song from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air as an example.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. I would never have thought of that. But it makes perfect sense. It's like that song is basically a mini story in itself with a beginning, middle, and end. And it definitely hits those emotional beats.
Exactly. It's a great reminder that even in casual conversation, we can borrow from those classic storytelling structures to make our anecdotes more compelling. Okay, so are you ready for this? One of the biggest takeaways from the book for me is actually about the importance of shutting up.
Wait, what? We're trying to get better at small talk. And you're telling me to be quiet. I'm so confused.
I know, right? It seems totally counterintuitive, but it's true. So many of us are just terrible listeners. We're so busy thinking about what we're going to say next, or trying to come up with the perfect witty response, that we're not really hearing what the other person is saying.
Oh my gosh, it's so true. It's like we're just waiting for our turn to talk,
Yeah.
not really engaging with the conversation or with the other person.
Totally. He actually compares it to actors in a play who are all talking over each other, completely missing their cues. It's chaotic and ultimately meaningless. So what he's really advocating for is something he calls active listening, which is about being truly present in the conversation, paying attention not just to the words, but to the emotions behind them.
So like asking clarifying questions.
Yeah,
Reflecting back what you're hearing, really making the other person feel heard and understood.
exactly. It's about creating that space for genuine connection. And it's a skill you can actually practice. He even suggests using those little phrases like, tell me more about that, or that's really interesting, to show that you're engaged and encourage them to continue.
Yeah. And of course, resisting that urge to interrupt, which I'll admit I struggle with.
Oh, yeah, me too.
Okay, so we've talked about the importance of listening. But what about those times when you're stuck in a conversation with someone who's just like a lot? You know those conversation vampires he talks about?
Oh, yeah, we all know a few.
They just suck the life out of you.
The people who dominate the conversation interrupt constantly, never seem to take a breath. It's exhausting.
He actually calls them emotional black holes, which I thought was a bit dramatic, but also kind of accurate.
Right. It can feel like all your conversational energy is being sucked away.
Clearly.
But the good news is he offers some really practical strategies for dealing with these types of personalities.
Okay, like what? Give me some tactics.
Well, he talks about the importance of setting boundaries, which can be as simple as politely redirecting the conversation, or even just excusing yourself if you need a break. He says you don't have to be a captive audience to someone else's monologue.
It's about recognizing your own needs in the conversation, too.
Yeah.
Like you're allowed to have limits.
And he also stresses the importance of being assertive, especially if someone is being disrespectful or crossing your boundaries. You don't have to tolerate bad behavior just to avoid being rude.
So it's about finding that balance
Mm.
of being respectful while also standing up for yourself.
Exactly. And he actually provides some helpful scripts for asserting yourself in these situations, like, I appreciate your perspective, but I'd like to share my thoughts now. Or, I understand you're passionate about this, but I need to step away for a moment.
Yeah. It's like having those pre-rehearsed responses in your back pocket for those moments when you need them. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, but there's one thing I'm still a little unclear about. What does he say about those awkward silences that inevitably pop up in conversations? You know those moments when you feel like you've run out of things to say and the panic starts to set in?
This is where he offers some surprisingly refreshing advice. Instead of dreading those silences, he says we should embrace them.
Embrace the silence.
Mhm.
But isn't that like the opposite of what we're going for here?
I know it sounds counterintuitive, but he makes a really good point. Those moments of quiet can actually be a really good thing.
Okay, how so?
Well, for one thing, it gives both people a chance to process what's been said and to formulate their next thought. It allows the conversation to breathe a little. And believe it or not, a little bit of silence can actually make you more comfortable with the other person. It shows that you don't feel pressured to fill every second with chatter.
That's so interesting. I feel like I've always thought of silence as this awkward thing to be avoided at all costs, but I can see how it could actually create a sense of ease and connection.
Exactly. It's all about shifting your perspective. And if the silence starts to feel a little too long, he says you can use those moments to maybe observe your surroundings, take a sip of your drink, just collect your thoughts. You can also use one of those handy acronyms he talked about to generate a new conversation topic.
Right, like HPM, SBR, or EDR.
Exactly.
It's like having that mental escape hatch for those moments when you feel yourself starting to panic.
Totally. One final takeaway from the book that I wanted to highlight is that this idea that conversation is a skill, not a talent.
Oh, I like that.
Right.
Meaning it's something you can learn and get better at with practice,
Yeah.
just like playing an instrument or learning a new language. It's not about being born with this magical ability to charm everyone you meet.
Exactly. It's about putting in the effort, learning the techniques,
Mhm.
and then just consistently practicing them in real life situations,
Yeah.
just showing up.
He really emphasizes that every conversation, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, is an opportunity to learn and grow.
And to not be afraid to make mistakes.
Right.
We all stumble and fumble our words sometimes. It's part of the process.
Totally. So we've covered a lot of ground here, from pre-conversation warm-ups to dealing with those difficult people, mastering the art of storytelling, and even learning to embrace those awkward silences. This book really does provide a pretty comprehensive guide to leveling up your small talk game.
It really does. And remember, it's not about becoming some smooth-talking social butterfly.
Right.
It's about those deeper connections, expanding your social circle, and ultimately living a richer, more fulfilling life.
And who doesn't want that? So I'm curious, from this deep dive,
Yeah.
what are your biggest takeaways so far? Like, what are you most excited to try out in your next conversation?
Yeah, for me, it's gotta be, oh gosh, how much power we actually have in those everyday interactions. It's not about becoming some super charismatic smooth talker. It's really about those small shifts in our mindset and in our approach.
Totally. So, how do we take all this amazing advice and actually use it in our lives?
Yeah.
Because it's one thing to listen to a podcast or read a book, but actually changing our habits, that's a whole other challenge.
Yeah, and he actually talks about that. He says to think of it like learning any new skill. It takes practice. You're not going to be perfect at it right away. And he even suggests setting small goals, achievable goals, like maybe initiating one conversation with a stranger each day, or really consciously practicing active listening during your next meeting or phone call.
Yeah, it's about building those conversational muscles gradually, right?
Exactly.
Like you wouldn't expect to run a marathon without training for it.
Exactly. And just like with physical exercise, some days it's going to feel easier than others. There are going to be days when you just don't want to talk or you feel that social anxiety coming up. But I think the key is to just keep showing up, keep putting yourself out there, even if it's just in small ways.
He also talks about the importance of looking at every interaction as an experiment, right? Trying out different techniques, seeing what works for you, and giving yourself permission to make mistakes without judgment.
That is such a good point. It's like approaching those conversations with curiosity and even playfulness rather than pressure or self-criticism.
Right. So it's less about, am I doing this right?
Yeah.
And more about, what can I learn from this interaction?
Yeah.
Even if it's a little awkward or it doesn't go exactly as planned. Right?
Exactly. You got it. One final thought from the book that I wanted to highlight was this idea that small talk isn't just about filling the silence or making polite chit-chat, It's about creating the potential for these deeper, more meaningful connections with people.
Yeah, and he tells this really sweet story about how he struck up a conversation with this woman at a coffee shop. And that random interaction actually blossomed into this lasting friendship.
Right.
And it's a good reminder that you never know where a conversation might lead.
That's so true. I love that.
So the next time you're feeling hesitant to talk to someone new, just remember you could be missing out on some incredible connection or experience.
So true.
So yeah.
Take a deep breath, remember the things we talked about, and just see where the conversation takes you.
You might be surprised.
Exactly.
Well, on that note, I think we're wrapping up our deep dive on better small talk. Hopefully you got some good stuff out of it. And are feeling ready to level up your conversational game.
Remember, it's not about changing who you are overnight. It's about those small changes that can make a big difference.
Love it. All right, everyone, go out there, embrace those opportunities for connection.
and see what amazing conversations unfold.